Within this lecture, we're going to be examining semicolons, colons, and apostrophes. Let's begin by examining semicolons. There are two times when we will use semicolons within our sentence. The first instance is when we are separating two complete sentences. In addition to separating two complete sentences, semicolons are also used to separate items in a list that already possess commas within those items. Let's look first at how to use a semicolon between two complete sentences. When we are discussing sentences, we must remember that a sentence has a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. Let's take a look at the following example. The red sleigh flew over the hills. Within this example, we'll note that we have a verb, flew. We also have a subject, who or what flew over the hills? The sleigh flew over the hills. We'll also note that this sentence has a complete thought. The red sleigh flew over the hills can stand alone. Let's take a look at another example sentence. The red sleigh flew over the hills. Snowflakes fell gently. Within this example, we'll note that we still have the subject and verb sleigh and flew. However, we also have an additional verb, fell. Who or what fell gently? Snowflakes fell gently. So within this sentence, we have two verbs and two subjects. We now need to ascertain whether we have two complete thoughts. In order to illustrate this, let's separate our subjects and our verbs into two separate sentences. The red sleigh flew over the hills is a complete sentence. Snowflakes fell gently is also a complete sentence. So here we have two sentences that are adjacent. However, if we have two complete sentences with no punctuation between them, we have a grammatical error. There are a number of ways that we can fix this grammatical error. We could add a period and capitalize snowflakes, separating these into two distinct sentences. We could add a comma and a coordinating conjunction. The red sleigh flew over the hills, comma, and snowflakes fell gently. However, we can also add a semicolon between these two sentences in order to join them. The red sleigh flew over the hills, semicolon, snowflakes fell gently. Semicolons can stand in for a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or a period and a capital letter. In other words, semicolons are strong enough to join two complete sentences by themselves. Let's take a look at another example. The turtle slid into the water. It swam into the distance. Within this sentence, try to identify the verbs. We should note the verbs slid and swam. So who or what slid into the water, and who or what swam into the distance? This question will give us our subjects, turtle and the pronoun it. Since we have two verbs and two subjects, there's the potential to have two complete sentences here if these possess thoughts that can stand alone. So let's divide this longer section into two sentences. The turtle slid into the water possesses a complete thought. It swam into the distance is also a complete thought that can stand by itself. So here, as in the previous example, we have two complete sentences. In order to join these sentences together, we can use a semicolon between them. The turtle slid into the water, semicolon. It swam into the distance. In addition to joining two sentences. Semicolons can also be used to separate items in a list. Let's take a look at the following example. I've lived in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa. These items can be separated by commas. The reader can then identify each distinct element within the sentence by looking for the ones between our commas. Here we know that South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa are the three items within this list. However, there are times where our items will possess commas. Let's take a look at the following example. I've lived in Canastota, South Dakota, Norfolk, Nebraska, and Ames, Iowa. In addition to the commas between our elements, you'll also note that we have a comma between our city and the state for each of the items within this list. As it can be difficult to identify the distinct items within a list that already possesses commas, we use semicolons to clearly differentiate each item. By adding these semicolons, we can easily see that Canastota, South Dakota, Norfolk, Nebraska, and Ames, Iowa are the units within this list. While there are instances where you will have other commas within items in a list, as this example shows, the primary example that you will be dealing with is when you are looking at lists of cities and states. So in addition to cities and states and items in a list, remember that semicolons are also used to separate two complete sentences. Let's now examine how to properly use colons within sentences. A colon is used to introduce a list. However, it is important to note that when we use colons, you must have a complete sentence before your colon. Remember that within a sentence, you must have a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. The last of these will be particularly important when trying to use colons. Let's take a look at this example. The backpack held several items: a scissors, a metal ruler, and pencils. Here you can see that we have a list of items. We need to ascertain now whether we have a complete sentence before this list. If we have a complete sentence before the list, we can insert a colon. Here you will note that we have a verb, held, as well as a subject. Who or what held several items? The backpack held several items. This portion of the sentence possesses a subject and a verb. We now need to ascertain whether it possesses a complete thought. The backpack held several items. This portion of the example possesses a complete thought and therefore represents a sentence. Since we have a complete sentence before our list, we can insert a colon before our list. The backpack held several items, colon, a scissors, a metal ruler, and pencils. Let's take a look at another example. The backpack held a scissors, a metal ruler, and pencils. As with the previous example, you'll note that we also have a list at the end of this sentence. You'll note that we also have a similar verb, held, as well as a subject, backpack. We now need to ascertain whether the beginning portion of this example is a complete sentence. The backpack held. This does not possess a complete thought, and therefore is not a sentence. Since we do not have a complete sentence before our list, we cannot use a colon before the list. The final version would then read, the backpack held a scissors, a metal ruler, and pencils. Let's take a look at one last example. The backpack held the following items: a scissors, a metal ruler, and pencils. Here again, we have our list, as well as our verb and subject. We now need to ascertain whether the beginning portion of this example has a complete thought. The backpack held the following items. We might contend that this does not possess a complete thought because it does not list the specific items. However, when examining colon usage, we should pay attention for the word following or follows. These two words denote an exception to our complete thought rule. If you have a sentence that possesses following or follows, we will place a colon before our list. Our final sentence would then read, the backpack held the following items, colon, a scissors, a metal ruler, and pencils. When using colons, it's important to remember that a colon precedes a list if there is a complete sentence before that list. Also remember that sentences that possess the word follows or following should be considered to have complete thoughts, even though they may not possess the list items mentioned. Now that we have looked at colons, let's move on to our last grammatical concept, apostrophes. While we will look at apostrophes in a later lesson, this lesson will focus on apostrophes and how they denote possession or ownership. In order to illustrate this, let's take a look at an example sentence. Ben's tools are on the brown bench in the garage. Here we should note the S on Ben's. Currently, with the spelling of this word, we are denoting that there are multiple Bens. However, this sentence does not mean that there are multiple Bens. Rather, it means that Ben possesses the ownership of these tools. In order to signify Ben's ownership of the tools, we will add an apostrophe before the S. Ben apostrophe S tools are on the brown bench in the garage. Let's take a look at another example. The team's jerseys were shipped yesterday. As in the previous example, we have an adjective denoting ownership. They are the team's jerseys. You'll note that this example is mentioning multiple teams. If we add an apostrophe before the S, we are signifying that there is only a single team. However, we want to denote that there are multiple teams' jerseys that were shipped yesterday. In order to illustrate this, we move our apostrophe from before the S to after. The team's S apostrophe jerseys were shipped yesterday. Remember that if we want to denote a singular noun, we put the apostrophe before the S. If we want to denote a plural noun, we put the apostrophe after the S. Let's look at another example sentence that uses apostrophes. The children's games were all placed in the same box. Within this sentence, you'll note the word children's. We now need to decide whether this adjective, which is expressing ownership of the games, should have an apostrophe S or S apostrophe. Before we can identify which of these versions is correct, however, we first need to identify the singular form of children. What is the singular form of children? Child would be considered the singular form of children. When we have words that change their form in order to make them plural, we will add an apostrophe s for the plural version. This sentence would then read, "The children's apostrophe s games were all placed in the same box." There are a number of words that take a different plural form. For instance, person becomes peoples. If we wanted to show possession, we would show apostrophe s for the plural version of peoples. Similarly, woman becomes women, and the possessive form of women would be apostrophe s. Man becomes men's, and apostrophe s would denote possession, and a deer would become deers, and apostrophe s. Now that we have examined semicolons, colons, and apostrophes, let's quickly review what we have discussed before moving on to some example sentences. Semicolons are used to join two complete sentences. Semicolons can also be used when we have items in a list that already possess commas. The most common example of this will be city and state. In addition to semicolons, we also have discussed colon usage. Colons precede a list if there is a complete sentence before the list. We should also remember to watch out for the words follows and following, as our sentence may not appear to have a complete thought if it possesses these words. It's important to distinguish between colons and semicolons. With a colon, you will have a complete sentence preceding your list. When you have semicolons, you will have a complete sentence before the semicolon as well as after the semicolon. Finally, we examined apostrophes. Apostrophes denote possession or ownership. If the adjective is singular, we will have apostrophe s. If we want to denote a plural adjective, we will have s apostrophe. Let's take a look at a few examples before concluding this lecture. We need to be sure the following parts are fixed: the calipers and the brakes. This sentence possesses a list at the end: calipers and brakes. This indicates that we are likely dealing with a colon usage. However, before we can incorporate a colon, we need to ascertain whether we have a complete sentence before this list. We should note the verb need, as well as the subject we. We now need to determine whether we have a complete thought before this list. We need to be sure the following parts are fixed. While this may sound as if it does not have a complete thought, we'll note the word following. If we have the word following within our sentence, it indicates that we will use a colon before our list. The final version would then read, we need to be sure the following parts are fixed: colon, the calipers, and the brakes. Let's look at another example. The mechanic was out of town. The car is still in the shop. Here we'll note that we have two verbs, was and is, as well as two subjects, mechanic and car. Since we have two verbs and two subjects, there's the potential to have two complete sentences if these sections possess complete thoughts. The mechanic was out of town. The car is still in the shop. Both of these sections of our example can stand by themselves, therefore they are complete sentences. Since we have two sentences back to back with no intervening punctuation marks, we need to place a semicolon between them. The final version would then read, "The mechanic was out of town, semicolon. The car is still in the shop." The two brothers' tricks were fun, but are now annoying. Within this example, we'll note the adjectives brothers, which is showing ownership of the tricks. Therefore, we are dealing with an issue of apostrophes. Now, will we place the apostrophe before the S or after? Since there are two brothers, we need to denote this by placing the apostrophe after the S. The two brothers, S apostrophe, tricks were fun, but are now annoying. Let's look at another example. People's jobs will be at stake if we consider a merger. Here, we'll note people's is denoting ownership of the jobs. Again, we are dealing with an issue of apostrophes. Will the apostrophe go before the S or after the S in people's? Since the singular version of people's is person, we will place the apostrophe before the S. People's apostrophe S job will be at stake if we consider a merger. Let's look at another example sentence. The company is likely to go bankrupt. A merger could save jobs. See if you can identify the error within this sentence. We can hopefully identify an error with semicolon usage. Here we have two complete sentences. The company is likely to go bankrupt. A merger could save some jobs. Since we have two complete sentences and no intervening punctuation, we need to add a semicolon between these two sections. The company is likely to go bankrupt, semicolon. A merger could save some jobs. Let's look at another example. There are many concerns such as the cost, the process, and the effects. Here we'll note the list at the end of our example. This list indicates that we are most likely dealing with an error of colon usage. If we have a list at the end of the sentence, we need to ascertain whether we have a complete sentence before the list. If we have a subject, verb, and complete thought before our list, we can insert a colon after the complete sentence and before the list. There are many concerns such as, since this portion falls off at the end and does not possess a complete thought, we cannot use a colon within this sentence. The final version would then read, there are many concerns such as the cost, the process, and the effects. Within this lesson, we have examined how to find and fix errors with semicolons, colons, and apostrophes.